everyone. Welcome to worship here. I hope you're on the right bus. Sky Island Unitarian Universalist Church? Okay. If anyone's new here and wants to get our newsletter, our name tag, there's some cards, I think, in the back. I don't know if we've made new ones. So you can, fill in the information. I won't make you stand up and embarrass you yet, but it's really nice having you with us today. And normally on a fourth Sunday, we take a second collection, but because there was if you have it with you and you want to give it, somehow let us know what it is. But we're probably going to do it next Sunday, so there'll be something in the newsletter and more people will know. Is that okay, David? Yeah.
What is that for?
Oh, St. Vincent de Paul. Yeah, you might have wondered who St. Vincent was up there. I didn't have room for his last name. So that's, obviously, when I worked in Tombstone, the St. Vincent de Paul and I were the two things working together in town. They're usually really good organization. Helping people with all sorts of bills and needs. Do we have any other announcements for the good of... Alrighty. Shall we begin our... Oh, I'm so confused. I'm so sorry. I'll begin with the chalice lighting. This was originally titled For a Community in Conflict, but I think I'm calling it Come into this community of your heart. It's anywhere you go that you might feel different emotions, and you're safe to do that here. It's by Reverend Amy Russell. You who feel your heart is breaking, come in. You who are confused and wondering, come in. You who are angry, in pain, or not wanting to be here, come in. You who are hopeful and energized, come in. Come into this community of your heart, where you have been held in love and in comfort, where you have shared your joy and your spirit, where you have asked questions because you felt they needed asking, where you have found friendship and companions, where you sometimes have not agreed and sometimes not felt comforted and sometimes not felt heard. Bring your broken heart and your grief, share them. Bring your confusion and your questions, share them. Bring your anger and your pain, share them. Bring your hope and your energy, share them. For here in this place, we can be together. We can gather in all the conflicting emotions tumbling around in our heads and our hearts. We bring them together here and lay them on the altar of community. For community means that fragile, not perfect human beings can come together in the name of peace and seek to find peace again. Peace, hope, healing. May it be so. We are a caring congregation and we share our joys and sorrows. I didn't find any back there. Ah, Karen.
I'm very slow.
We don't have to rush today. So Karen Horton's longtime travels buddy, Angie, died October 11th in Australia, just a month after Jim. And we lift up Sue Heron, who is in the hospital but improving, and we just send good thoughts her way, and that healing continues. And Phil Taylor is in Tucson, recovering. He was septic from, I can see, kidney stones. I can see it. I just can't say the word, kidney stones. And, but doing better. getting ornery, which Ellen thinks is a really good sign. So, but please keep her and Phil in your thoughts. Right. And I will put stones in. Oh dear. An extra for anything unspoken that is joyful or weighs heavily on our hearts. Today we are going to look a little bit at grief, but hopefully in a way that is helpful, that isn't just depressing, but helps us stay with the feelings and maybe be able to move and use them and heal. And so I looked at a lot of children's stories. Today's story for all is called, I took an excerpt from it, I'm Happy Sad Today. And the writer is Lori Britton, and the illustrator is Matthew Rivera, but I'm just using a snippet of it. I was looking at books that talk about feelings and helping kids deal with them. And in this book, the young woman has realized she can have many feelings at once. When her brother was born, she was proud of him, but jealous at all the attention he got. When she saw a new kid at school, she was happy, but too shy to speak to her. And so she says, and I begin here, when I have more than one feeling inside of me, I don't have to choose just one. I know that all my feelings are okay at the same time. If I want to, I can tell my friends about my feelings. Or I can tell an adult, a grown-up, about all my feelings. I can say what happened and how I feel. Sometimes I don't even have to talk. I can just be with someone and feel better. Sometimes when my feelings are mixed together, I like to pretend that my animals have the same feelings I do. Oops, and you can go forward. I can dance and swirl around just like the feelings inside of me. Moving helps me feel better. I can even paint 2 pictures at the same time to show those feelings together. And you can show that slide. If you can, yeah. Oops, all right. Well, so she's painting with 2 hands, 2 really beautiful, swirly, multicolored pictures, because she's painting 2 feelings at once. And I make up my own words for my together feelings sometimes. If I'm sad and mad together, I can say I'm smad. Or if I'm feeling shy and happy, I can say I'm shappy. I can make up a lot of pretend feeling words. And you know what? When I'm older, sometimes I'll still have different feelings mixed together inside of me. And that's okay. And there's a picture of her surrounded by posters that say, Happicided, Hapsad, Braverus, Sighted, Love-appy, and Glappy. Oh, and there you are. Yeah. And so many of the children's books, like all of the adult books I look through, have one piece of advice. If you feel like it, talk about it with your friends or an adult, or just sit with someone. And that's the tricky nature of grief. It's important to share, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes it might not be safe. And sometimes it's really important to do. So I looked at the work of Reverend Jan Richardson, who's a United Methodist minister, but all the UU ministers I know follow her. She is an artist and a minister and a poet and a writer. And in 2013, her husband died unexpectedly. They were fixing, they thought, the aorta in his brain, and it caused a stroke, and he never woke up. And she has spent years living with that grief, painting about that grief, writing poems about that grief. And she's proof that it helped her to share, but it has helped other people. As one woman says, her writings and her art have become an anchor for other people's grief. So I wanted to begin before the homily by reading one of her poems. It's called Blessing of Breathing. And Saran Sidime, who is a young podcaster, sort of a social justice podcaster who writes about hidden grief, says, breath reminds us that we still have life. My breath will not consume me as long as I have breath. And so she really loves this poem by Jan Richardson that I'm about to read. But I'm going to start by having everyone, if you feel like it, closing your eyes and taking in a deep breath. Or two. And feel your body. If it's itching or hurting or coughing, no worries. Just be with your body, it's fine. Be with all its tickles and aches, and just be with it. And be with your mind. If your thoughts are swirling, that's okay. Watch them fly past, run into you, swirl. Just be with all your thoughts. And feel your heart. If your emotions are calm, great. Feel that. If your emotions are up and down like a roller coaster, that's fine too. Just watch them ride by. Just be with them. Hear these words, the blessing of breathing by Reverend Jan Richardson, that the first breath will come without fear. That the second breath will come without pain. The third breath, that it will come without despair. And the fourth, without anxiety. That the fifth breath will come with no bitterness. That the sixth breath will come for joy. Breath 7, that it will come for love. May the 8th breath come for freedom, and the 9th for delight. When the 10th breath comes, may it be for us to breathe together. And the next. And the next, until our breathing is as one, until our breathing is no more. Thank you for doing that with me. Thank you for coming back and waking up and being with me. 2 weeks ago, I had an experience that I want to impose on all of you. Now, I'll give you the backstory, and I don't know if I can make it happen, but it seemed really important to try. For 2 years, even before the pandemic, I've been meeting with women from all over the world to discuss a specific type of psychology and practice it on each other. And it's just become a support group in the time of COVID. And every Saturday morning, we talk for a little while. And it was a wonderfully supportive group until about a month ago. And every meeting, 2 people ranted and ranted about the vaccination and how much they didn't want to have to take it. And it's understandable, there's time to share what's bothering you, but it went over and over and over. And I knew it had nothing to do with the vaccination. Something deeper is happening that is polarizing us, that is pulling us apart. And yet, recently I was starting to be sucked in because my son and my brother-in-law both had COVID recently and had very few symptoms, thanks to the vaccine, right? I started wanting to defend it like it was my best friend. And I knew that was useless. That wasn't helpful. Something more was going on. So I talked to another group of friends. I said, what do I do? Do I just quit? It isn't feeding me. It's vitriolic. I hate it. And they said, well, remind them sharing is supposed to be 2 minutes. Tell them, in the 12-step programs, which we aren't, but, do this for 2 minutes and time each other. So when I came to the meeting Saturday before last, I was prepared and I got up the courage and I said, we're going to time. And the learning we were doing, the lesson was about grief. And everybody started sharing about their grief. And everybody was on the same page about grief. And one of them said, oh, have we gone over time? I said, no, this is the lesson. This is helpful. This is that underlying something, or at least one of them, that is touching so many people right now. How many of you have memory lapses at all that are kind of unusual for you? How many of you have mixed up, I cannot remember if something happened in 2020 or 2021. Right. At the end of the service, I'm going to invite you to share stories at whatever level you feel comfortable about how grief may be hitting you. I think part of what happened with my group was we were surprised by how numb we were. We weren't really feeling pain. We were just stupid. We just couldn't remember anything. And some of them were fighting all the time. And once we realized it was about grief, and of course that tags many different kinds of grief, we could talk about it. One woman lost her son 3 years ago. He wasn't even 30 yet. That's a very important grief. That's probably a big reason why she's so anti-vaccine, right? We could all talk about those things. We felt safe. So at the end, at whatever level, like the silly forgetfulnesses or something deeper, if you want to share anything together in this space about grief, it might be helpful. It certainly will make me feel less alone. So at the end, I'm warning you, you don't have to do it, but you will be invited. And you don't have to take my word for it that sharing with other people is helpful. Have you ever found it helpful to talk to other people about grief? Yeah, we've all experienced, many of us have experienced that. This week I listened to a podcast, The Tim Ferriss Show, an old podcast he did with Navy SEAL Rick Norris. Rick is pretty amazing. He's really good at different competitions, climbing, and he's actually not very tall, and his arm span is shorter than his length. That's a disadvantage as well, but he does really well. He's really physically fit. But he realized after a few years of being back and after he'd left the military, he just wasn't himself. He just was this kind of blah, unfeeling, numb person. Eventually he discovered it was a kind of depression that came from the many things he had experienced while he was overseas. But he discovered that what really helped him was being forced to be part of, he went on a retreat in San Diego with a group of entrepreneurs. And they did a workshop where you had to share the ups and downs of your life. He said it was like I'd been to the cardiologist. It was up and down and up. And he said, he'd never been willing to share those things with people before. And he and the podcaster said there's almost a kind of competition. When you know it's safe, it's going to be kept in confidence, and you want to share more than the last guy. So he said, being more open and communicating grief that I had swallowed and kept hidden away was really important. He'd lost a bunch of friends in combat, but he'd also lost his father and a younger brother, and all the griefs were there bottled up. When he talks about it, the more he talks about it, it gets easier. He says, now I can actually talk about it and I'm not a mess. Before he described how his face looked and the snot. But now he can do it in public more prettily. I find myself able to talk about it. I'm dealing with it instead of keeping it suppressed, and I'm better for it. He also thinks when he talks about people who are lost in combat, he's honoring their memory and keeping them alive by talking about them. But the thing he said that really stuck out for me, talking about grief has been something that's unlocked a lot of happiness for me. When you suppress the grief, you can also suppress the joy. Stephen Levine, who has written a lot about death from a Buddhist perspective, has some beautiful meditations, wrote a book called Untended Sorrow. And he believes that we have all these little losses all the time in our lives, but if we don't tend them and note them and mourn them and feel them, that we start to restrict ourselves so that we won't feel them. And in the process, we feel less sorrow and less joy. I'm sure you've heard that combination before. They sort of come together. And so it's really important to find a way to be with people and be able to talk about sharing grief. I haven't found anything really compelling, really good scientific data that explains why it's good to talk about grief in community. The psychotherapist Miriam Greenspan uses the word intervulnerability, that we have intervulnerability with each other when we have mutually held space. When I can talk and you can talk, it's solace for you to speak, but I also gain from hearing you. My father died when I was in seminary. I'd like to say that's why it took me 10 years. There are probably a lot of other reasons. But I was pretty much alone in Chicago with my family back in Washington, D.C. And I discovered how valuable reading the grief stories of other people could be. A friend of mine had taken a pastoral care course and had a grief observed by C.S. Lewis. He always enjoyed C.S. Lewis until this book. And he said, well, I've never had a grief. We were in our early 20s. So I don't understand this. This guy is ranting. He's talking in a circular way. He's talking about emotions. Maybe you'll find it helpful. And of course I did. To hear C.S. Lewis broken by grief and ranting and not making sense was very comforting when I couldn't write papers because I wasn't making any sense. Anne Morrow Lindbergh, the wife of Charles Lindbergh, wrote a number of journals. And I never really enjoyed them until after my father's death, I read Hour of Gold and Hour of Lead. And she describes meeting and marrying Charles Lindbergh and having their baby. And then her father, who was a senator, dies. Their son is kidnapped and dies. And it's painful to slog through, but it was really helpful to walk with her. And in the middle of it all, she didn't find what Jan Richardson would call a fake silver lining. She found one of those graces that can appear when you're tending to grief. She realized there's this beautiful paragraph where she talks about her baby and how in his short life he had done so much. He had been a joy for her father while her father was alive, and a great joy for her mother after her father died so suddenly. And this little baby had made their family a real family, ready to welcome other children, which they did eventually. It's helpful for me, I don't know if it's been helpful for you, to explore with other people their own crazy meanderings through grief. There may be stages, but they're not linear. And there may be things we go through and come back to again. You may feel strange things like boredom or relief. And it's nice to know you're not alone. You're not crazy. And that other people have walked there with you or are walking there too. And there's something very powerful about sitting in difficult emotions that can be freeing. There's a wonderful book that Reverend Matthew introduced me to called Radical Dharma. And in it, Yasmin Seydullah, a feminist queer professor, writes about her experience of learning to meditate. She was forced to do it by a world history course. She wasn't sure about Buddhism, but she went to try it out. And she went to sit, and the second time or so, something happened. She was breathing, and she was getting into the rhythm, and then she said, I felt it. It wasn't bliss. It wasn't nirvana. It started in my stomach, a violent kind of grief-like pain. The slow eruption of shattered glass began to rise like a volcano, up from my core, like so much indigestible garbage. I did not dare move. I didn't know yet what I was feeling. I would only put words to it later. It was a blinding rage. It was a bottomless sadness. I had been at home in whiteness so long. I had no idea how abandoned I felt in my own body. She felt like she walked around for the next week feeling like she'd been abandoned by her best friend, and she realized she had. For so many years, she hadn't listened to herself, trying to fit in. And she calls this chapter Abolishing Whiteness, abolishing that from her life. Sitting in that grief was painful, but she kept coming back. She said partly for her grade, but also because this discomfort that was wrenching her apart was showing her a way of living she could no longer do and allowing a more authentic self to come forth. It's a really powerful book, and the premise of Radical Dharma is if we sit in these things, not only do we transform as people, but as communities, and then we can also work on the world. I mentioned Saran Sidibe, who's from Guinea, West Africa. She has a podcast called Hidden Grief, and it's this lovely juxtaposition of social justice and grief, and different types of grief that we don't usually talk about. So she interviews her white mentor who talks about white grief, what it is like to inhabit a white body when you are in a country where whiteness has caused so much pain. He's married to a black woman, he's active in the black church, it's present in his face all the time. He talks about going to a church in Harlem that was his denomination, it was Church of God. And so he didn't know he was in Harlem, he walks in and he's whisked to the minister because he's the only black person in the church. And nowadays, he would have been whisked to the minister because they would be very careful of a white man coming into a black church after the shootings at Mother Emanuel. But in this day, in the 1970s, he was whisked in because they needed an associate pastor, and suddenly he was. So Saran explores those griefs we don't often always name. She says, at first she named her podcast Beyond Death and Dying because she wanted to talk to people about the melancholy associated with experiencing racism. And she kept talking about these different griefs we don't normally tend, but she had to go back to Jan Richardson and interview her like a fangirl. She was gushing all over her and had to talk about death and dying. And I think Jan says the most important thing, There's something about grief that wants to be seen. I know from the conversations I have with people, from the exchanges I have with people, so many of us carry griefs we don't feel we can speak. There is something about grief that needs to be seen. And yet, in my experience, even the most unspeakable parts of grief are speakable. And that's what she puts forth in her paintings, her collages, her poems, those broken parts that only make sense to her of her journey in grief. She says it requires a certain amount of discernment, though. You have to know that you can entrust this story and this grief to that person. And if someone comes up to you, you're going to know you can handle it. It might not be the day to embrace somebody else's grief. But overall, it's really important to sit with other humans. Francis Weller in The Wild Edge of Sorrow talks about how ritual can really, really help with grief. And we don't have enough of those anymore. It used to be a very communal experience. It was something we shared. Thank goodness we still have weddings and memorial services. That's the one area of life where people will reach out to me, even if they never come to church. People need ritual for beginnings and endings. And of course, weddings can be endings and memorial services can be beginnings, right? But it's really important to have that ritual. It's important to sit with friends. And if we don't, Weller says, we'll repeat it to ourselves and we'll recycle it, and it's harder to let go. So I hope we can find ways to speak of this. It's hard to just talk about grief without it pulling on many other parts of grief, right? And many other parts of ourselves. But I don't know if any of you have anything you want to share about a time that you realized, oh my goodness, that was caused by grief. Or something you're feeling right now that if you name it, you might be less numb. Or you might be forgiving of yourself. Over and over again, the Buddhists I've been reading talk about that. Embracing your sadness, embracing yourself. It is always welcome. You should never be embarrassed. And I shared with you that I can't keep straight 2020 and 2021 in really embarrassing ways. All the other ministers in the Baja Four are much younger than I am, and one of them created a spreadsheet completely based on 2020, completely confusing the rest of us. So it's clearly a widespread grief experience, and not that I'm getting older entirely. Was there a time that you found, yes?
I put my brother's flag in the window. I put my brother's flag, his memorial flag, when I was 16. He died in Germany in the service, and this is the first time I put it in view. And I'm living at the Marianne Apartments. I just moved here the 5th of this month from Flagstaff. And I have an apartment all to myself right now. And I'm loving it. And I feel blessed that I can do that. And I feel like he's with me now more than ever.
Right.
And I'm grateful to God, and my heart soars that you're sharing this brief talk, and that I feel closer to him. I also have felt that my mother's in the backyard with all these butterflies, because I always felt that she was, a little like a butterfly that flew by in Flagstaff, and I wrote a little poem about my mother. Was that you, Mom? The butterfly that just flew by my window? And I shared that with a girlfriend, and she said, that's the most beautiful poem I ever read. And I was living in a situation, and it got lost. And I've never tried to rewrite that, But I see your butterflies here, and I think of my mother. And I'm very grateful that I'm here in Sierra Vista with your butterflies and my flag in the window. Thank you.
And one of the things I think we all know, but I just want to reiterate it, the people we love, we do not lose them. We do not forget them. It may get slightly easier. There's a meme on Facebook I find very helpful about the waves that come and hit you like a tsunami. They just space out, but there's still tsunami waves that come every once in a while unexpectedly. I think with grief, we start to live into it, but the people we love are still with us, are they not? And we need to honor them. And so many times people are asked, well, why aren't you over it? Why haven't you moved on? Why haven't you forgotten? And we can't do that, right? Yeah. And of course, there are griefs that aren't about death. There are losses we have that could be about something else. You know, like a job, an identity, the ability to walk, think straight, families moving. There's so many we have in our lives, aren't there? Yes, Howard.
I want to talk about, is that on?
Yes.
I want to talk about grief. When my father died, I watched them take his body away, put a tag on. I was there. It was off. It's all good. It took 2 days before I realized that he was gone. So grief kind of was postponed. And that's weird. Because I was like, it didn't bother me at the time, but 2 days later, it hit me. And I think a lot of people handle death or grief, and it takes a while before it hits them. And that's all I got to say about that.
I think it does. A good friend of mine lost her mother. She was 15, I was 17. Her mother and sister died in a fire. And they said, and she came to talk to me. I was the person she knew. I was shocked that the adults would say, we've never gone through anything like this. I thought the adults would know, right? And so I went to a counselor who said, at 15, she's going to put this grief down and come back to it later in pieces. Like when she gets married, or, when her mother isn't there, or, all those life stages, all those milestones. Sometimes, for some reason, we put it down. Sometimes we can't handle it, or sometimes we're just not ready, right? It felt weird, right? But there's no...
Well, it felt like you had to take care of everything.
Right.
And then feel later.
And then feel later. And that's true. Yeah, it's so weird. Why do they make people who've just lost somebody run a marathon of documents and, rituals? And it's just bizarre. Yeah. Any other types of loss you might want to... Oh, Georgia, and then Chris.
I think my grief has to come with just... Oh, I think my grief has to come with just the fact that we are all growing old, and I feel like every day there's something else I can't do, or somebody else that's gone, or I don't know. It just seems like if there was an easy way to get old, there doesn't seem to be an easy way to get old.
Chris, sorry. Pat, and then Chris.
Hello. Being the youngest sibling, I lost all of my siblings, but in 1 year, I lost my father, my mother, and a brother. And it was hard to deal with that in 1 year. And there was a lot going on in my life so that compensated for it. And their memories are always with me. The hardest of all was losing my wife. I was prepared for that grief for 2 years, and when it did happen, it hit me hard. But my joy today is that their memories are with me every day. So that's how I get by.
Hi, I'm brand new here today. My name is Chris. Just really shortly lately, age 74, I'm all of a sudden realizing that things I remembered my whole life, and I'm able to remember, I'm not anymore. And I try to think about something and try to bring it up and remember and talk to somebody about it, and I can't remember it. And I'm sure a lot of people might have the same experience, and so I just wanted to bring that out a little bit.
Yeah, an extra grief, because, you know, we keep these people with us, but if we can't remember the details, it's a bit like losing them again.
Yeah, I immigrated from New Zealand at a very young age to Canada and then on to the U.S. And so consequently, I was away from my family and all my friends, etc. And when they died and that, it was no big deal. I was kind of busy. I was trying to make a career, raise a family, etc. And so I didn't have much exposure to death. Yes, some of my acquaintances passed away, but that was just happened. And then a few years ago, a close friend of mine that I went through elementary school, high school, college, and and he lived in Australia, and I'd seen him over the years, and he passed away. And by gosh, that sure made me realize that, wow, we are vulnerable. And then I realized I was getting a little older, and then the thing with my wife at the current time, I'm realizing, wow, I'm not invincible. I'm running out of time. But then, Georgia, I had a little, I don't know where I got this piece of paper from, I can't quote it exactly, but it was kind of that age, yes, you're getting older, but age is an opportunity that has been denied to so many people.
Oh, sorry, Howard.
By the way, age is a rite of passage. But on the other side of grief, weddings, births, we get to experience them.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're all rituals of love. And we wouldn't feel, I think, those griefs so much. I went to a Mormon funeral this week, and the president of the congregation said something I was going to share with my hospice, but I'm going to share it with you instead. He said, you know, we could take away the sting of death, but then we take away the depth of love, right? They go together because grief is sensing what we've loved, what we don't have in physical form, what isn't there around us. So Howard, yeah, I'm glad that we have all these rituals that are mixed, you know. Even a baptism can be strange if a loved one isn't there. Or, yeah, everything in life is somewhat bittersweet, but the beauty is there's that beauty in it. So I invite you, where it is safe, where you're with people you love, to seek out those places you can talk about grief, even if it's just alone in the shower, but especially with other humans, naming it. I found it really hard. I was determined when I was in seminary and I was 25. I wasn't going to be bowed by my father's death, and I started thinking strangely because I wasn't feeling. And every day I'd force myself to sit down and have a good cry. Now, I'm not, this evil minister is not advocating, you must cry every day. But, as Rick Norris discovered, the more you sit with it and talk to it and understand it, it has less power over you. And all the children's books talk about the value of sitting with feelings, but also regulating yourself. Adults are too good at that. Kids might not know it at all. But if you sit with your feelings and you don't run from them, they become a lot less scary, right?